He hadn't heard laughter in that kitchen since the day the preacher buried his wife on the hill. For 2 long years, the only sounds in Levi Carroll's cabin were the wind moaning through the pines and the lonely crackle of his fire. Silence was a thick blanket he'd wrapped around himself, a shroud to keep the world out. And then, on a cold Tuesday afternoon, a woman laughed. It wasn't loud. It wasn't meant for him. But it sliced through the quiet like a lightning strike, sharp and unexpected, and terrifyingly alive. It struck Levi like a crack through river ice, and for a second he forgot how to breathe. The woman was a widowed seamstress from town, a woman named Eleanor. Her sleeves were rolled up, a needle still clutched in her hand, and she was giggling. She was giggling at his coffee pot, which had sputtered and hissed like a cornered snake before spitting a jet of black coffee across his clean floorboards. "It's possessed," she teased, and her eyes were bright with a kind of mischief the house hadn't seen since Lydia was alive, since before the fire. And Levi, a man frozen by the sound of simple joy, could only stand and stare as if an angel had just walked through his wall. He hadn't just forgotten laughter, he'd forgotten it was possible. For months his cabin had been a tomb. Every creak of the floorboards was an echo. Every breath he took was a ghost in the cold air. But that one single, simple laugh scattered the stillness, like sunlight blasting through a dusty window. It was so out of place it felt like a violation. She saw the look on his face and immediately covered her mouth, her cheeks flushing red. "Forgive me," she murmured, suddenly shy. "I shouldn't have." He saw the joy vanish from her eyes, snuffed out by the heavy silence she'd just broken, and something inside him panicked. He found himself shaking his head, the words coming out slow and rough, as if his throat had forgotten how to make them. "Don't you stop." His voice was a gravelly thing, strange even to his own ears, too deep, too raw. "Not ever," he finished, the words hanging in the air between them. Something in her eyes softened. She didn't see a gruff mountain man. She saw the raw ache behind the command. She saw a man drowning in quiet, and she'd just thrown him a rope. She was only there to mend a coat he'd torn clearing brush near the river. It was a simple job, one he could have done himself if he'd found the will to care about torn things anymore. But the truth was, he hadn't hired her for the stitching. He didn't care about the coat. He'd hired her for the memory of warmth. He'd seen her once in town, hunched over a table in the Mercantile, her widow's shawl faded and thin, her fingers moving with a tireless, nimble grace. There was something in the gentle curve of her face, in the determined set of her jaw, that made him remember what it felt like to not be cold from the inside out. He'd made up the story about the coat just to have a reason to bring her up the mountain, just to see if a flicker of life could still exist within his four walls. Now, standing in his kitchen, that same woman looked up at him, her cheeks flushed from the firelight, and said softly, "Your wife must have kept this place clean as a prayer." The words were a punch to the gut. No one had dared speak Lydia's name to him in 2 years. He wanted to answer, to say her name out loud, but the word was a fishbone caught in his throat. Instead, he just watched as the seamstress, Eleanor, turned away, brushed a few crumbs from his table, and started to hum a tune so faint he could barely make it out. It was a sad, sweet melody that seemed to fit the room perfectly. As she worked, her spool of thread, a pale, shining blue, rolled off the table and across the worn floorboards. They both bent to pick it up at the same time. His rough, calloused fingers brushed against hers. The touch was like a static shock, and they both flinched back as if burned. The thread, thin and shining, coiled between their hands for a split second before she pulled away, whispering, "I'll finish this by morning." He just nodded, unable to move. The fire snapped and popped, casting her shadow long and tall across the wall, making her seem larger than life. And for the first time, Levi realized the house didn't feel hollow anymore. It felt occupied. She finished the patch on his sleeve and held it up to the light, inspecting her work. Then she laughed again, quieter this time. But the sound, so small and unafraid, slipped right past his defenses and found a home in the empty space where his heart used to be. He tried to look away, to retreat back into his grief, but he couldn't. The sight of her, sleeves dusted with soot, a loose strand of hair falling across her shoulder, filled him with a powerful ache he didn't have a name for. It wasn't just sadness anymore. It was something else entirely. When she turned to hang her own coat near the stove, he spoke, his voice low, half to himself. "Didn't think this room remembered joy." She met his gaze, and her answer was a simple, honest truth that hit him harder than any sermon. "Sometimes, a room only needs someone to listen." Then she smiled, a quiet, gentle thing that glowed warmer than the fire in the hearth. And Levi Carroll stood there, struck dumb, as if some part of him that he'd buried on the hill 2 years ago had just taken its first shuddering breath. Outside, the wind sighed through the pines, and it sounded less like a mournful cry and more like a sigh of relief. He had thought his heart was dead and buried, but the sound of laughter, he was starting to realize, might just be the first sign that it had survived after all. By morning, the frost had painted silver filigree on the porch rail. The sound of her humming drifted from the kitchen, where a single lamp still burned low against the gray dawn. Levi stood by the window, watching the faint, white plume of her breath rise in the cold air as she gathered her sewing things. For a fleeting moment, a dangerous moment, he forgot she was only here to mend a coat. He forgot she was supposed to leave. "You must have loved her dearly," she said suddenly, her voice soft but steady. She didn't turn around, her hands still expertly working the torn fabric on her lap. He hesitated. No one had spoken of his wife in 2 winters. The question was a sudden intrusion, a careless step on holy ground. He crossed the room, his boots unnaturally quiet on the plank floor, and stood behind her. "Ain't sure what word fits it anymore," he finally muttered, the admission costing him more than he expected. "She's in everything I touch." The seamstress nodded slowly, her thumb running over a set of faded initials stitched near the coat's inside seam. They were almost invisible, hidden in the lining. Her brow furrowed as she leaned closer to the lamplight, trying to make them out. The light caught the old thread just right. "LC," she read aloud, her voice laced with confusion. She looked up at him. "This isn't your mark." Levi went rigid. His blood turned to ice in his veins. He hadn't thought about those letters in years. They were stitched in gold silk, a lifetime ago, by a hand that was now dust. Those letters didn't stand for Levi Carroll. They stood for Lydia Karen, his wife's maiden name. He had completely forgotten that this wasn't his coat. It was hers. "It was hers," he said, his throat tightening until he could barely force the words out. "She used to mend my pockets before the winters came. I must have grabbed it by mistake." But it wasn't a mistake. He knew in some deep, unvisited part of his soul that he had chosen this coat deliberately. He had chosen the one thing that still held her touch. The seamstress traced the letters one more time, her touch so gentle it was as if she were feeling for the ghost of the woman who made them. "She had a gentle stitch," she whispered, and the quiet observation was filled with a profound, almost sacred respect. The silence that followed was heavy enough to bend the air between them, thick with unspoken grief, and a tenderness too fragile to name. He had brought this woman here to mend a coat, but she was uncovering something far more torn. Levi lowered himself onto the stool across from her, his knees weak. He watched her fingers move, swift and patient and certain, as she finished the repair. And for the first time, the constant, dull ache in his chest wasn't just grief. It was something else. It was memory turning soft at the edges, losing its power to cut. "You're like you're healing it," he said, trying to make his voice sound lighter than it felt. She gave a quiet, knowing laugh, and one corner of her mouth lifted in a sad smile. "Maybe that's all sewing is," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Holding torn things together till they remember they were whole." The words hung in the air like a prayer, an absolution he didn't know he needed. She finished the last stitch, bit the thread with her teeth, and laid the coat carefully over the back of a chair. "There," she said, dusting her hands, "strong enough to face another season." Levi stood, his legs feeling unsteady. He picked up the coat, testing the mended sleeve. His voice was caught in his throat again. "You've got her patience," he said, the words too low for her to hear. But she looked up anyway, as if she'd heard the thought behind them. And in her eyes there was no pity. There was only a calm, deep understanding, the look of someone who had also sat through long, lonely nights, listening to a house breathe without another soul inside it. "How long's it been?" she asked gently, her voice a balm on a raw wound. "Since she passed." He swallowed hard. 2 years, he said, since the river thawed last. She nodded once, a gesture that said she understood more than he'd said. "That's long enough for silence to start sounding like company." A ghost of a smile touched his lips at that. "And you?" he asked, turning the question back on her. "How long since you lost yours?" Her hands, which had been so steady, paused for just a fraction of a second over her spool of thread. 3, she answered, her voice quiet but firm. "But grief doesn't keep a clock. It just changes its shape." She rose then, gathering her things, the spell between them broken. He followed her to the door, a sudden panic seizing him. He couldn't let her walk out. He couldn't let the silence return. "You'll come again?" he asked, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. She blinked, surprised by his forwardness. Then a faint, tired smile touched her lips. "If there's more to mend," she said, and her eyes dropped pointedly to the frayed, sun-bleached curtain by the sink, fluttering in the draught from the poorly sealed window. "Seems there might be." Then she stepped out into the biting cold, her shawl drawn tight around her thin shoulders. She left behind the faint scent of soap, the warmth of her presence, and the small blue spool of thread she'd forgotten on his table. Its color caught the gray morning light like a quiet promise, a promise that she'd be back, a promise that the silence was not forever. By late afternoon, the wind had turned mean. It tore through the valley like a beast loosed from its chain, howling and clawing at the lonely cabin. And by nightfall, the snow began. It didn't drift down gently. It came sideways, sharp and endless, a blinding white curtain that devoured the fence posts and buried the path whole. Levi bolted the door, then bolted it again. He fed the fire until it roared like a dragon in the hearth, but even its mighty voice couldn't drown out the shriek of the storm outside. The world was disappearing under a blanket of white. And then he heard it. A knock. It was barely a tap, a faint, desperate sound almost lost in the gale. He thought he'd imagined it, a ghost rapping at the door. Then it came again, fainter this time, but certain. He wrenched the door open against a gust of wind that nearly stole his breath and ripped the heavy wood from his hand. And there she was, Eleanor, a phantom in the blizzard, her shawl soaked through and frozen stiff, her hair plastered to her temples with ice. She was clutching a small wooden sewing box under one arm like it was the most precious thing in the world. "I was halfway home," she shouted over the wind, her voice trembling violently from the cold. "The road. It just vanished. Your light was the only one I could see." He didn't say a word. He just stepped aside, grabbing her arm and pulling her inside, out of the storm's teeth. "You'll freeze if you stay another minute out there," he said, slamming the door against the raging storm. She tried to smile, her lips blue. "Wouldn't be the first time." He stripped the dripping, frozen shawl from her shoulders and hung it by the fire, where it immediately began to steam. He fetched his thickest wool blanket and wrapped it around her. Her hands were shaking too hard to hold the tin cup of coffee he offered, so he steadied it between her palms, his fingers covering hers, until the tremors began to ease. "You're safe here," he said, and he wasn't sure which of them needed to believe it more. The storm rattled the windows, howling like grief itself, a raw and primal scream. But inside those four walls, with the fire roaring and another human being breathing the same air, something tender began to build, a warmth that wasn't just from the flames. She set her sewing box on the table, the latch clicking softly in the charged silence. "I can't sit idle," she said with a weak laugh. "My hands, they forget how to rest." "Then mend if you must," he said, easing into the chair opposite her. "But not for coin tonight." She met his eyes across the flickering firelight, a question in their depths. "Then for what?" she asked, her voice a whisper. "For company," he answered. That made her smile, a tired smile, but a true one. She pulled out a strip of dark cloth, a piece torn from the edge of her own ruined shawl, and began to stitch by lamplight. She started humming under her breath, that same sad, sweet tune, a melody to steady her shaking hands. The thread she used glinted in the glow. It was blue, the same spool she'd left on his table that morning. Levi found himself mesmerized, watching her fingers, the steady, rhythmic dance of the needle, the quiet, unspoken skill in every single motion. "You sew like it matters to the world," he murmured, the words slipping out unbidden. She didn't look up from her work. "It does," she said simply. "Every stitch says something survived." The words sat between them like scripture, a truth so profound it made the air feel thin. The fire snapped, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. Outside, the storm beat harder against the cabin, the snow thickening against the shutters, trying to get in. He rose to check the latch on the window to make sure it was holding against the assault. Her voice stopped him. "Will it hold?" she asked, her voice small against the roar of the wind. "It's old," he said, his hand on the cold iron. "But it's strong." She looked at him then, a strange intensity in her gaze. "Like you," she said quietly. Then she bit her lip, a flush of color rising on her pale cheeks, as if embarrassed by the raw honesty of the statement. He turned back toward her, his heart giving a painful lurch. He was caught by the flush on her cheeks, by the way the lamplight carved soft shadows around her face, making her look both fragile and unbreakable. "No," he said softly, the confession tearing from a place he kept locked away. "I break more than I hold." She looked down at her mending, at the blue thread pulling two torn pieces of fabric together. "Then it's good I mend," she replied. And her laughter, thin and watery but real, threaded through the sound of the wind like a quiet challenge, a small act of defiance against the storm, raging both outside and in. Hours later, the fury outside had dulled to a low, exhausted moan. He found her asleep at the table, her head pillowed on her arms. The needle was still clutched loosely between her fingers. The blue thread trailed from the half-mended cloth across her palm and onto the table. Levi stood there for a long time, the fire burned down to glowing embers, the silence in the room deep and profound. He thought that if heaven still bothered to speak to men like him, this must be its language, the quiet sight of two broken souls, kept alive by one small stitch at a time. He lifted her gently. She was lighter than he expected, as if her grief had hollowed her out. He carried her to the large armchair by the hearth and draped another blanket over her shoulders. As he laid her down, the spool of blue thread rolled off the table and came to a stop at the toe of his boot. It unwound just enough for the end of the thread to touch him. He stared at it for a long moment. He didn't understand why, but he felt a strange compulsion. He bent down, picked up the end of the thin blue thread, and looped it once around his little finger. He didn't tie a knot. It was just a simple loop, a silent promise, a vow he wasn't yet ready to name. Morning came slow and gray, the world outside buried and silent. The storm had finally burned itself out, leaving behind a silence so complete it seemed to ring in his ears. Levi stirred the ashes in the hearth, coaxing the embers back to life. When he turned around, he found her awake. She was sitting up in the chair, the blanket clutched around her shoulders, her eyes fixed on his hand. She was staring at the single loop of blue thread still wrapped around his finger. "You fell asleep mending," he said, trying for a half smile, suddenly embarrassed by how much softer his voice sounded than it used to. She returned a faint smile of her own. "You fell asleep guarding." The way she said it, gentle and almost teasing, made something tight in his chest shift and loosen. "Didn't mean to," he muttered, turning to pour coffee, needing something to do with his hands. "Old habit." "Your wife must have slept easier for it," she said quietly. He froze. The coffee mug was halfway to his lips. He set it down on the table with exaggerated care, the tin making a soft clink in the stillness. "She never woke up," he said simply. The words hit the air like stones dropping into a deep, still well, the ripples spreading out, disturbing the quiet between them. The truth of it, spoken aloud for the first time to another living soul, was brutal and stark. For a long, breathless moment, she didn't speak. She just studied him with those uncanny eyes of hers, eyes that saw far more than they should. Then she drew a slow, shuddering breath. "I know what that silence feels like." Her tone had changed completely. It was lower now, raw and stripped of all pretense. "My husband, he died in a fire. Our shop, it went up one night while we slept in the back room. I made it out." She paused, her gaze turning towards the newly stoked flames in the hearth. "He didn't." Levi turned toward her sharply, every muscle in his body tensed for the tears he expected to see. But she wasn't crying. Her eyes were dry, her face a mask of old, worn pain. She just stared into the coals, her voice eerily steady as it trembled. "That smell, smoke and iron, it stays in your skin, in your hair. I thought if I just kept sewing, I could stitch the scent away." She gave a small, humorless laugh that was more like a sob. "But grief doesn't wash out. It only learns to wear new clothes." The confession hung between them, heavy and sacred and awful. It was a shared secret from a club no one ever wanted to join. Levi reached for the kettle on the stove, not because he wanted more coffee, but just to have a reason to move, to steady his own shaking hands. The room felt like it was tilting. "The fire took her, too," he said, his back to her, his voice a low, ragged thing. The confession was torn from him, an answer to a question she hadn't even asked. "Barn caught first. By the time I reached her, the roof had gone." He didn't speak of the scream that still ripped him from sleep in the dead of night. He didn't speak of the way he'd buried the sickening smell of burnt pine and something else behind every breath he'd taken for 2 years. He didn't have to. He turned to look at her, and her eyes told him she already knew. She knew the nightmares. She knew the guilt. She knew the smell. "Seems we've both been living in the smoke," she whispered, and the words were a revelation, an explanation. "Maybe that's why we found each other." He looked at her then, really looked at her, not as a widow or a seamstress, but as a fellow survivor. He saw the delicate, astonishing strength in her face, the way grief hadn't hollowed her out, but had instead shaped her into something resilient, something enduring. The blue thread on her discarded mending glimmered faintly where it lay on the table. "You ever stop feeling guilty for surviving?" he asked, the words raw and unfamiliar on his tongue. It was the question that haunted his every waking moment. "No," she said, her honesty a clean, sharp blade. "But I started feeling grateful. It's a smaller feeling, but it burns longer." He exhaled, a sound halfway between a sigh and a prayer, the breath he'd been holding for 2 years. Grateful for what? For moments like this, she said, and her voice finally broke, just slightly, on the last word. She reached for the torn strip of cloth she'd been mending, the one she'd fallen asleep working on, and handed it to him. You finish it. He almost smiled. I can't sew. Then just pull the thread, she said, her hand guiding his. Gently, their fingers touched. Her hand was trembling. His was calloused and unsure. Together they drew the final stitch tight, knotting the end with a care that felt like a sacred ceremony. When it was done, she looked at the simple, repaired scrap of cloth. There, she said softly, something whole again. He looked at the mended fabric in his hands. It was nothing, just a repaired scrap. Yet somehow, in the gray morning light, it seemed to glow with a significance that staggered him. It was proof. Proof that redemption didn't need to be some grand, glorious act. It only needed to be real. It only needed one small stitch. He looked back at her, at the woman who had walked out of a storm and into the wreckage of his life. You can stay, he said, the offer feeling both terrifying and inevitable. Stay till the thaw, if you'd like. The roads will be bad for days. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached across the table and her fingers gently brushed against the blue thread still looped around his finger. Maybe I already decided to, she said. Outside, the sun finally broke through the clouds, rising slow and brilliant over the snowbound hills. And for the first time in 2 years, Levi Carroll didn't turn away from the light. The sun rose pale and thin through a high veil of cloud, melting the frost from the window panes and washing the cabin in a softer kind of light than it had known in years. Levi stood by the stove, his sleeves rolled up, pouring cornmeal batter into a hot skillet. It hissed and sizzled, as if the old pan was surprised to be useful again. The smell of frying corn cakes filled the air, mixing with wood smoke and something else, something faintly sweet. It was the smell of a morning, not a morning. Behind him, Eleanor stirred in the big armchair. The blanket slid from her shoulders, her hair loose and tangled from sleep. You cook too? She asked, her voice still rough, not with sorrow, but with sleep. A man alone learns or starves, he said, a half-smile touching his lips. Never promised it'd be good, though. She rose, rubbing warmth back into her arms, and crossed to the table. The little blue spool of thread still lay there where they'd left it. The last stitch from the night before, the one they'd pulled together, seemed to curl like a question mark that neither of them had answered yet. She picked up the spool, wrapping the loose end once around her own finger. You kept it, she said quietly, looking not at him, but at the thread connecting his hand to the spool in hers. Didn't mean to, he lied, his voice gruff. She looked up at him then, and the corners of her mouth lifted in a small, knowing smile that made his heart beat a little faster. Sometimes our hands tell the truth before our mouths do. He busied himself with the skillet, flipping the cakes, needing to look away from the intensity of her gaze. He set a plate in front of her, 2 uneven corn cakes, browned a little too long on one side. Don't laugh, he warned. But her chuckle came anyway, bright and sudden and completely without reservation. It was the sound of yesterday's ice breaking apart completely, melting into a running stream. He shook his head, trying to look stern, but failing miserably. You're impossible. I'm grateful, she said softly, taking a bite. She chewed thoughtfully for a moment, then swallowed. And it's good, she declared. It tastes like someone tried. The simple words landed deeper than she could have possibly intended. They were a validation of the last 2 years of just trying. Trying to get up. Trying to breathe. Trying to survive. For a moment he forgot to breathe himself. He sat down opposite her, his elbows on the rough-hewn table, and just studied her. He watched the way her eyelashes caught the morning light. He noticed the small lines at the corners of her eyes, the ones that deepened when she smiled. "You ever think," he asked, his voice low, "that maybe that's all life asks of us, to just keep trying, even when the stitching won't hold?" She met his gaze, her expression serious now. "And when it does hold?" "Then you keep mending," he said, the words feeling true as he spoke them, "till it's strong enough to wear again." They ate in silence after that, but it was a different kind of silence. It wasn't the empty, hollow kind that used to hang in the rafters of the house like a ghost. This was an easy silence, a shared silence, filled only by the sound of forks on tin plates and the wind sighing outside like an old, familiar friend. When they finished, she rose to wash the dishes, her sleeves rolled high, humming that same tune from before. The melody no longer sounded sad to him. It sounded hopeful. He found himself stopping whatever he was doing just to listen. Leaning against the doorway with his arms crossed, he finally asked, "That song, where'd you learn it?" "My husband," she said, her eyes still on the soapy water. "He used to whistle it when he worked at the forge. I thought I'd forgotten it completely, until last night." A shadow passed over her face, a fleeting memory of another fire, another loss. "Then keep singing it," he said softly, instinctively wanting to chase the shadow away. "It might help me remember something too." She turned then, her hands wet and dripping, and for a long heartbeat, the space between them hummed with everything they hadn't said. The air was thick with shared grief, with a fragile gratitude, and with something new, something that was growing just beyond the reach of words. Then she smiled faintly, breaking the spell with a touch of humor. "Careful, Mr. Carroll," she teased. "You'll have me thinking this old kitchen is charmed." "Maybe it is," he said, his voice serious. "You laughed in it. Twice. That's more magic than I've seen in 2 years." She laughed again at that, a full, genuine laugh this time, wiping her hands on a rag and shaking her head. "And you call me impossible?" The sound of her laughter filled the small room, and this time he joined her. His own laugh was a low, rusty, unused thing, but it was real. It felt so real that even the old log walls of the cabin seemed to sigh in relief. Outside, a heavy sheet of snow slid from the roof with a soft thud, hitting the ground below. Spring was still a long way off, but inside that kitchen the thaw had already begun. The storm left behind a world scrubbed clean. White hills rolled under a painfully blue sky, and a profound hush settled over the valley. A silence that felt merciful, not lonely. A few days passed. Eleanor packed her sewing things, her intention firm: return to town before the next snow moved in. But when she opened the cabin door, the cold hit her like a physical blow, and she saw it. The fierce wind from the storm had been so powerful it had actually snapped the iron latch on her wagon's wheel, leaving it useless. "Best not to travel till it warms up for good," Levi said, standing behind her, studying the bruised-looking sky to the west. "You'll break more than spokes if you try that road now." She sighed, a sound of half-hearted protest. "I have orders waiting in town. A seamstress without work is just a dreamer with a needle." He smiled at that. "Then stay and mend my curtains again. God knows they're ashamed of the drafts they let in." Her laugh was quick and bright, a welcome sound. But when she stepped to the window to inspect the frayed fabric, her smile faded. The pane of glass had cracked during the storm. It was a thin, sharp line, like a wound that refused to close, running from one edge to the other. She ran her thumb along it, careful not to draw blood. "You can't stitch glass," she murmured, more to herself than to him. "Some things you can only hold together by standing near them." "I'll fix it," he said immediately. She turned, shaking her head. "You don't have to do that." "I do," he said simply, his gaze steady. "You've been sewing the world back together for both of us. It's time I tried my hand." He took a hammer from the pegs on the wall and went outside, his boots crunching through the deep snow. She watched from inside, her heart tight in her chest as he worked. He was steady and patient, his movements economical and sure, the same way she threaded her needle. He sealed the cracked pane with scrap wood and pine resin until not a single breath of cold wind could slip through. When he came back in, his cheeks were flushed red from the cold, his breath pluming in the warm air of the cabin. "It's rough," he said, gesturing back at the window, "but it'll hold." "You fixed it," she said, surprised by the way her own words trembled. He shrugged, embarrassed by her gratitude. "It's not pretty, but it's strong." "Like us," she whispered before she could stop herself. The words were out, hanging in the air between them. He froze, his expression unreadable. Then a slow, deep smile spread across his face. It wasn't a smile of humor. It was a smile of pure recognition. "Like us," he repeated, his voice low and certain. The room went quiet again, but this time the silence wasn't heavy with grief. It was full. It was full of unspoken understanding. She turned toward the hearth, pretending to busy herself with her spool of thread, needing to break the intensity of his gaze. The thread caught the light, a vibrant slash of blue against the dimness of the cabin. "Seems I've run out of every other color," she said, her voice light, trying to sound casual. "Blue is all I have left." "Keep it," he said, his voice dropping even lower. "It reminds me of the sky, of what's left after the storms pass." She met his eyes then, and something in the way he said it, the raw softness, the unspoken ache, made her throat tighten. "You ever think of leaving this place?" she asked, the question surprising them both. "Not till lately," he admitted. "Why now?" "Because for the first time," he said, "it wouldn't feel like I was running away." Her breath caught in her chest. For a long moment they just stood there, two broken things stitched together by silence and circumstance, trying to find a name for what they had become. Then she spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "When I came here, I only meant to stay for the night." "Then let the night take its time," he replied. A real smile, the kind that reached her eyes and made them shine, lit up her face. "You're full of sayings for a man who barely spoke 2 words when I first met him." "I didn't have anything to say," he confessed, "until you laughed in my kitchen." Her cheeks colored at the memory. "You make it sound like I cast a spell on you." "Maybe you did," he said, taking a step closer, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. "And maybe I don't ever want it undone." She looked away quickly, pretending to thread her needle, though her hands were shaking too much to manage it. "Careful, Mr. Carroll. A woman could start believing you mean that." "I do," he said quietly. And though she didn't lift her eyes from her fumbling hands, she smiled all the same. Outside, the light began to shift as the sun dipped lower. Snow dripped from the roof in slow, steady drops, the sound like a quiet, persistent heartbeat against the earth. Inside, the cracked window no longer shivered in the wind, and for the first time in a very long time, neither did she. By the time the big thaw began and the roads became passable, word had already run through town like wildfire. The story twisted and grew with every telling. How the quiet, widowed seamstress hadn't been seen at her boarding house for weeks. How Levi Carroll, the grieving hermit on the hill, kept his lamp burning late every single night. And strangest of all, how the sound of a woman's laughter had been heard drifting down from his porch long after dark. Eleanor heard the whispers first when she finally went to the market for cloth and thread. The shopkeeper's wife, a woman with a sour face and eyes as bright and hungry as a crow's, leaned in close over the counter. "Hope you're keeping warm up there, dear," she said, her voice a low, conspiratorial hiss. "Mr. Carroll's cabin must be mighty cozy these days." The words were meant to sting, and they did, not for their cruelty, but for the shard of truth buried under the malice. I mend where the work takes me, Eleanor said, her voice perfectly even as she set her coins on the counter. The cold doesn't ask for permission. The woman gave a tight, unpleasant smile, the kind gossipers use when the lie they've invented pleases them more than the plain truth. Oh, I'm sure it doesn't. By the time Eleanor left the store, heads were already turning. Whispers fluttered behind her back like a flock of nervous sparrows. When she reached her wagon, Levi was there, waiting. His hat was pulled low, and the lines around his eyes were drawn tight with anger. I heard, he said simply. You shouldn't have to. It'll pass, she said, her voice betraying a tremor she couldn't control as she fumbled with the horse's hitch. Gossip always does. No, he said, his hand suddenly closing over hers, stopping her. It won't. Not if you leave it to rot in the dark. Let them talk to my face. She shook her head, her voice finally breaking. And give them more reason to. Levi, they already think I'm... Let them, he interrupted, his tone firm but gentle, his grip on her hand unwavering. They'll get tired of their own noise sooner than the truth ever will. She looked away, blinking hard against the sudden burn of tears. You don't understand. A widow's name is all she has left in this world. Then let me give it back some honor, he said. The words stunned her into silence. Her breath caught in her throat. For the first time she saw not the man that grief had hollowed out, but the man that grief had refined. He was still strong, yes, but it was a different kind of strength now. A quiet, steady kindness that was as unshakable as the mountain itself. You'd stand up for me like that? She whispered, her voice filled with awe. I already have, he said. Every time they called you a fool for coming up that hill to my cabin. A small, watery smile touched her lips. And what do they call you? A man who still believes decency is worth the trouble. He helped her onto the wagon seat, his touch gentle. But when she turned to thank him, she saw them. A small crowd of watchers, gathered by the mercantile, their faces hungry for a confirmation of the ugly stories they were telling themselves. Levi saw them too. He straightened to his full height, his shoulders squared, and met every single stare head-on. He didn't flinch. He didn't look away. Afternoon, he said, his voice calm and carrying clear across the muddy street. One by one the watchers turned away, murmuring to each other, pretending to care about the price of flour or the threat of more rain. He waited until they were all gone before he spoke to her again. You shouldn't have to hide. And you shouldn't have to invite a fire into your own house, she replied, her voice half whisper, half plea. I've lived through worse burns than gossip, he said simply. The road back to the cabin was quiet, the only sounds the clatter of the wagon wheels and the slow, uneven rhythm of two hearts still too afraid to name what they had become to each other. When they reached the cabin, she climbed down and stood for a long moment, just looking at the cracked window he had mended. The warm lamplight was spilling out through the rough wooden patch. They'll always talk, she said finally, her voice resigned. Then let them, he answered, coming to stand beside her. We'll just have to keep giving them something decent to talk about. Her laugh came then, soft but certain, a sound of surrender and relief all at once. When she stepped inside the cabin, the room itself seemed to breathe easier. Outside, the gossip continued to wind its way across the hills, losing its heat with every mile it traveled. But inside the cabin, the warmth held steady. It was proof that sometimes the truest act of defiance is simply to continue to live in peace. That night, as the lamp burned low, she picked up her needle and a piece of cloth. You'll have to let me mend that curtain after all, she whispered. I thought it was fixed, he said, confused. Not from this side, she replied, smiling through her tiredness. And Levi, watching her face in the soft glow of the lamp, realized that no rumor, no matter how vicious, could ever touch what was real between them. She woke before the dawn, while the house was still cloaked in a cold, gray silence. Without a sound, she packed her few things: the thread, the needle, the little blue spool. Each item was tucked away like a secret, too heavy to leave behind, but too fragile to keep showing the world. Levi was asleep in the armchair by the fire, his hat tipped low over his face, one hand resting on the stock of the rifle he hadn't needed to touch since she came. She watched him for a long, aching moment, memorizing the shape of peace on his sleeping face, the small crease at his brow that only ever softened when he slept. She wanted to wake him. She wanted to tell him why she had to go. She wanted to explain that the talk in town had turned sharper, meaner, that even the pastor's wife had stopped her by the creek and called her reckless, a woman tempting misfortune and shame. But Levi had already given her more than anyone had in 3 long years. He had given her kindness without a bargain attached. She couldn't repay that kindness by letting his good name be dragged through the mud and stained with her shame. She stepped to the table and laid a small folded scrap of cloth on the wood. It was the piece of curtain she had mended, the piece torn from one of his old shirts. On it, stitched in the same pale blue thread, were 2 simple letters, L and E. Levi and Eleanor. It wasn't a confession. It wasn't a promise. It was a goodbye. But just as her hand reached for the cold iron of the door latch, his voice came from the shadows, low and rough with sleep. "You meant to leave without breakfast?" She froze, her eyes squeezing shut in defeat. "I didn't want to wake you." "Then you should have been quieter," he said. He was standing now, pulling on his coat, his movements slow and deliberate. His tone wasn't angry. It was weary, the weary sound of a man who thought the storm had finally passed, only to see the clouds gathering again on the horizon. "The town's gotten cruel," she whispered, her back still to him. "And I won't have them saying your charity turned into a scandal." He moved closer, his boots slow and heavy against the plank floor. "Charity." The word cracked from him, soft but sharp as broken glass. "Is that what you think this is?" She wouldn't look at him. She couldn't. "You've been kind to me, Mr. Carroll, but kindness isn't armor against talk like that." "No," he said, his voice right behind her now. "But truth is—" She turned then, her eyes wet but her gaze steady. "The truth doesn't feed gossip, Levi. It just gives them more to chew on." "Maybe not," he said, "but it starves the lies." For a long heartbeat they stood in the dim half-light of the dawn, her shawl half-packed, his jaw set in a stubborn line, the space between them crackling with everything they had fought so hard not to say. "You could come with me," she said quietly. The words were not a plea, but a surrender. "We could start fresh somewhere new, a place where no one knows the sound of our names." He shook his head slowly, a deep sadness in his eyes. "My wife is buried on that hill. The man I used to be is buried there with her. I reckon I'm not done becoming whoever comes next." The words were a gentle refusal, but they cut her to the quick. Her throat tightened. "And what about me?" "You," he said, stepping so close she could feel the warmth from his body. "You belong where you're safe, not where you're silent." She tried to speak, to argue, but the lump in her chest broke apart into a small, helpless, watery laugh. "You always find the right words just when I'm trying my hardest to run away from them." "That's how I know you're meant to stay," he said. He reached past her and lifted her sewing box from the table, setting it gently back in her hands. "You told me once that sewing is what keeps you alive. Then keep at it. Right here." She stared at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "And if the town never forgives us?" "Then let them learn," he said, his voice ringing with a conviction that made her shiver. "Decency is a lesson they forgot a long time ago." The tears fell freely now, hot and unashamed. You'll have to remind me how to laugh when it gets hard again, she whispered. You taught me first, he answered. He opened the door, letting the golden light of the dawn spill into the room like a new breath, a new beginning. The light caught on the single loop of blue thread still wound around his little finger. She looked at it, her own hand trembling. You still keep it. I'll keep it till you tell me to let go, he said. Then don't, she whispered. Not ever. And when she stepped back from the doorway, letting him close the door on the cold and the cruel whispers of the world, he knew. She had chosen to stay, not because the world had suddenly grown kind, but because one small corner of it finally had. Spring came quiet that year. The last of the snow melted from the high ridge behind the cabin, and the grass returned like a slow, stubborn forgiveness, pushing up green and hopeful where it had every right to be barren. Levi and Eleanor worked side by side, falling into a rhythm as natural as the changing seasons. Most days he was out mending fences, and she was at the table, stitching curtains and mending clothes for half the valley. Her laughter, once a rare and startling sound, became a constant, carrying on the breeze farther than it used to. Some evenings the children from town, the same ones who'd once been told not to speak her name, would appear on the porch, holding out torn hems and ripped sleeves for her to fix. She never asked for a single coin. They'll learn that mending things matters, she'd say, and Levi would watch from the porch swing, a quiet smile on his face, the kind of smile that said this, right here, was what survival actually looked like. The talk in town eventually softened, as gossip always does, when it's met with nothing but quiet patience and unrelenting decency. The same women who had whispered behind their hands now came knocking on the door, asking for new quilts and mended lace. Eleanor would greet them kindly, never with pride, but with the calm assurance of a woman who knew her place was exactly where she stood. When one of them remarked that her hands must ache from so much constant work, she only smiled and said, "They ached worse when they had nothing to do." One evening, as the sun was setting, Levi found her by the open window, the same one he'd clumsily patched through the winter. She was bathed in the amber light of the magic hour, her needle moving with a steady, peaceful rhythm through a piece of fine linen. "What are you making now?" he asked, leaning against the window frame. "Something foolish," she said with a small, self-conscious laugh. "A tablecloth. I thought it was time this house looked like someone actually meant to live here." He crossed the room to her, resting a hand on the back of her chair. "It already does," he said softly. She looked up at him, her eyes bright but soft in the fading light. Her gaze dropped to his hand. "You're still keeping that thread." He lifted his hand. Around his little finger, the loop of blue thread, faded now to the pale color of a summer sky, was still there, tied neat. "Haven't found a single reason to take it off yet," he said. "You could, you know," she said gently. "You've earned your peace." "Maybe," he answered, his voice low. "But peace isn't the same thing as forgetting." She looked down at her sewing, a gentle smile playing on her lips. "Then neither of us ever will." He reached into his pocket and drew out something small and gold, a thimble, polished bright from years of use. "You left this the night you nearly left for good." She took it from him, her thumb brushing over the familiar dent along its edge. "I guess it's proof we both decided to stay." He nodded once, then bent slightly and pressed a kiss to the crown of her head. It was the smallest of gestures. No grand vow, no promise shouted to the wind, but it landed with the simple, undeniable weight of truth. Outside, the lamp in the window flickered, the same light that had guided her through the storm all those months ago. The pale blue thread on his hand caught its glow, glinting between them like a living line, a stitch that held them together. When he turned to close the shutters against the coming night, she spoke softly. Don't. Let it burn a while longer. He smiled, leaving the window open to the darkness. All right, for anyone else who might still be wandering. Later, when the fire had burned down to embers and her sewing lay folded neatly beside them, Eleanor reached over and took his hand in hers. The faded blue thread brushed against her wrist as their fingers intertwined. "It feels strange," she whispered, her head resting on his shoulder, "to build something new out of the ruins." "Strange," he agreed, his voice a low rumble in his chest, "and holy." The night settled around them like a warm quilt, one stitched together from all the things they had lost, and all the things they had chosen to keep. And somewhere outside, in the darkness, the spring rain began to fall, gentle, rhythmic, and steady, like a heartbeat finally learning the sound of the world again. If you enjoyed this story, please like, share, and subscribe to support more tales of hope and resilience on Stories Left Behind. Now we have to ask you, if you saw that little blue thread wrapped around his hand, a reminder of all the pain he'd been through, would you have told him to let it go or to keep it forever? Let us know your answer in the comments below.